Hey everyone, welcome to Logan's Mosh Pit. Glad to have you here. Do me a favor and please subscribe if you haven't already. Gather round bookworms, cause the time has come for another episode of Rock and Read. Today we'll read chapter 3 of Heavier Than Heaven, the Kurt Cobain biography by Charles R. Cross. I want to warn you, chapter 3 contains a lot of suicide stories. If this makes you too uncomfortable, please stop watching. Go watch something else. I edited out the most disturbing details. Chapter 3 is called MEATBALL of the Month. Here we go. In September 1979, Kurt began 7th grade at Montesino Junior High School. It was an important milestone, and school began to take on a bigger role in his life. He had begun music classes in 5th grade, and by 7th grade he was playing drums with the school band, an accomplishment he sought to downplay to his friends while also savoring it. Most of what he studied and practiced was marching band or small ensemble drums, learning snare and bass drum for songs like Louie Louie and Tequila. The Monte band rarely marched. Mostly they played for assemblies or basketball games, but Kurt was a fixture at any event where they appeared. His band director, Tim Nelson, remembered him as a regular, run-of-the-mill music student. He was not extraordinary, but he also wasn't awful. Kurt was pictured that year in the Montesino Sylvan yearbook playing snare drum at an assembly. He had a page boy haircut and looked a bit like a young Brad Pitt. His clothing tended toward preppy. A typical outfit included hash bell-bottom jeans, a striped Izod rugby shirt, and Nike athletic sneakers. He dressed like every other 12-year-old, though he was slightly short and small for his age. As one of the more popular kids in school, he was selected to be profiled in the October 26, 1979 edition of the mimeographed student newspaper, The Puppy Press. The article ran under the heading, MEATBALL of the Month, and read, "Kurt is a 7th grader at our school. He has blonde hair and blue eyes. He thinks school is alright. Kurt's favorite class is band, and his favorite teacher is Mr. Hepp. His favorite food and drink are pizza and Coke. His favorite saying is, 'Excuse you.' His favorite song is 'Don't Bring Me Down' by ELO, and his favorite rock group is Meatloaf. His favorite TV show is Taxi, and his favorite actor is Burt Reynolds." The "excuse you" saying was Kurt's twist on Steve Martin's "Excuse Me." This was consistent with his wry, sarcastic sense of humor, which involved transposing phases or asking absurd rhetorical questions. Imagine an adolescent Andy Rooney. Typical of these jokes was when he shouted out at a bonfire, "How can you ruin a perfectly good fire by making smoke?" Being a small boy, his method of surviving within the adolescent male culture was to joke his way out of conflicts and belittle any tormentors with his superior intellect. Kurt watched countless hours of television. This was a running battle with Don and Jenny. They wished to limit his hours in front of the tube, but he begged and screamed for more. When he was denied this freedom, he'd simply visit his best friend, Rod Marsh, who lived a block away, and watch television there. Though Saturday Night Live was past his bedtime, he rarely missed a week, and the next Monday at school he'd be imitating all the best skits. He also did a wicked impression of Latka, the Andy Kaufman character on Taxi. The previous summer, Kurt had dropped out of Little League, but when winter came, he joined the junior varsity wrestling squad, which pleased his father. Don attended every match and endlessly quizzed Kurt on his progress. The coach was Kenichi Kano, the Monte art teacher, and Kurt joined the team as much to spend more time with Kano as to wrestle. In Kano, Kurt found a male role model who encouraged his creativity, and he became Kano's favorite student. One of Kurt's drawings was featured on the cover of the Puppy Press that Halloween. It showed a bulldog, Montesino's mascot, emptying a trick-or-treat bag on a doghouse. In typical Cobain touch, he hid a can of beer among the candy. For a Christmas card that year, Kurt drew a pen and ink portrait of a small boy who was attempting to fish, but cast the hook into his back. It was as good as most Hallmark cards. As classmate Nikki Clark remembered it, Kurt's artwork was always very good. Kano never had to help him since he seemed like an advanced student. Even when he wasn't in art class, Clark recalled, Kurt was never far from a pen. He doodled constantly in every class. Ronnie Toira was Kurt's girlfriend in 7th grade, but it was an innocent first crush that never got serious. He gave her a piece of his art to tie their union. There were kids in school that clearly were troubled or were outcasts, but he wasn't one of them, she said. About the only thing that was different was that he was quieter than most kids. He wasn't unsociable, just quiet. At home, he was anything but quiet, complaining vociferously over what he felt was unfair treatment from Dawn or Jenny. Few second marriages with children ever meld perfectly, but this one was always on delicate ground, and issues of favoritism and fairness would haunt the family. Kurt's complaints usually led to arguments between Dawn and Jenny, or increased his parents' rancor, which continued to simmer over issues of visitation and child support. Dawn complained that Wendy made Kim phone if his support check was late by a day. Toward the end of 7th grade, the school nurse called and said Kurt's proportions were what they considered borderline for scoliosis, or curvature of the spine. Dawn and Jenny took Kurt to a doctor, and after a thorough examination, the physician determined that Kurt didn't suffer from the syndrome. He simply had longer arms than most kids his size, which made the original measurements seem askew. But this didn't reassure Wendy. Through the family system of communication, which resembled a bad version of the children's game of telephone, she had heard Kurt had scoliosis. She was shocked Dawn wasn't alarmed and that Kurt wasn't in a full body cast. Kurt decided to believe his mother's diagnosis and in later years claimed he had minor scoliosis in junior high. Though his assertion is at odds with the facts, Kurt used it as one more example of how his father had failed him. Like many children in divorce, Kurt masterfully played each parent off the other. In 1980, Wendy was working in Monte at the county commissioner's office, and Kurt frequently visited her after school, if only to report on some new torture put upon him by Dawn or Jenny. As things got worse for Kurt in Monte, he hoped Wendy would take him back, but his mother had her own problems at the time with Frank Frenich. She told Kim she feared that if Kurt witnessed the dysfunction in her home, he would turn gay. Years later, when Kurt brought up the topic with Wendy and Kim, his mom told him, "Kurt, you don't even know what it was like. You would have ended up in juvie or jail." One of Kurt's repeated laments to Wendy was that Jenny's children were favored in the household. When Jenny's ex-husband would give Mindy and James gifts, Kurt felt jealous. Kurt assumed any discipline out to him was because he wasn't Jenny's biological child. He told his friends he hated Jenny, complained about her cooking, and claimed she rationed how much soda he was allowed to drink. He asserted Jenny could hear a Pepsi can open from 3 rooms away. And for lunch, he was allowed only 2 slices of Carl Budding ham per sandwich and 2 grandma's cookies. Leland Cobain would lecture Dawn about what he also thought was a prejudice against Kurt. There could be fruit sitting on the table, and Mindy or James could go up and take an apple and start eating it. Kurt would go get one like that, and Donnie would give him hell for it. Leland speculated Dawn was so afraid Jenny would leave him like Wendy had that he sided with Jenny and her children. Dawn admitted discipline was more of a problem with Kurt than with Jenny's kids, but argued it was because of Kurt's personality, not favoritism. But Dawn did worry that Jenny would leave him if Kurt became too much trouble. "I was afraid that it was going to get to that point of either he goes or she goes, and I didn't want to lose her." Kurt's relationship with his siblings and step-siblings became more balanced as he grew older. He adored his half-brother Chad because he loved babies. He'd punch Mindy, but on occasions when there was no school, he'd spend the day playing with her. Yet when Kurt's schoolmates would mention his family, several of his buddies thought Mindy was cute. He was quick to correct them if they called her his sister. He described Mindy to his friends as, "Not my sister, my dad's new wife's daughter," speaking the words as if she were some torture he was forced to endure. He and James got along better, perhaps because Kurt was never overshadowed by the younger boy. When another boy slugged James, who was the bat boy on one of Kurt's baseball teams, Kurt stepped in and threatened the attacker. They also shared an interest in movies. In the summer, the family would go to a 2-screen drive-in. Dawn and Jenny would each take a car, then park one with the kids in front of the PG-rated movie, while they'd watch a more adult film on the other screen. Kurt taught James that rather than having to sit through another Don Knotts comedy, they could walk to the bathroom and view more adult fare, like heavy metal, which Kurt loved, by standing just outside the lot. Kurt enjoyed describing films he had already seen to his younger stepbrother. He had watched Close Encounters of the Third Kind the previous year and could recite all the dialogue from the film. He used to play with his mashed potatoes at dinner and make them into the shape of a mountain from that movie, James recalled. In 1981, at 14, Kurt began to make his own short films, using his parents' Super 8 camera. One of his first productions was an elaborate Orson Welles War of the Worlds ripoff that showed aliens, played by figures that Kurt sculpted with clay, landing in the Cobain backyard. He showed the alien film to James in a successful attempt to convince the younger boy that their home had been invaded. Another film he made in 1982 shows a far darker side of his psyche. The film is complete with special effects, fake blood, and Kurt dramatically playing out his own final death scene in a manner that he must have seen in silent pictures. This gruesome film simply added ammunition to concerns his parents already had about a darkness they saw inside him. There was something wrong, Jenny argued. Something wrong with his thought process, even from the beginning. Something unbalanced. He was able to calmly discuss the kind of events that would give most young boys nightmares. He wasn't the only teenage boy in history to bring up self-slaughter, but the offhanded way he joked about it struck his friends as odd. One day he and John Fields were walking home from school when Fields told Kurt he should be an artist, but Kurt casually announced he had other plans. "I'm going to be a superstar musician, kill myself, and go out in a flame of glory," he said. "Kurt, that's the stupidest thing I ever heard. Don't talk that way," Fields replied, but Kurt was steadfast. "No, I want to be rich and famous and die like Jimi Hendrix." Neither boy was aware at the time that Hendrix's death wasn't suicide. Fields was not the only friend of Kurt's from Monte who reported such a story. A half-dozen other acquaintances tell similar versions of the same conversation, always with the same dark outcome. That Kurt would be talking differently about suicide at age 14 didn't surprise anyone in the family. 2 years earlier, Kurt's great-uncle, 66-year-old Burla Cobain, Leland's oldest brother, had used a snub-nosed .38 pistol to shoot himself in both the stomach and the head. The year prior to Burley's suicide, in 1978, Leland's brother Ernest had died of a cerebral hemorrhage. While Ernest's death at 57 was not officially ruled a suicide, it came after he had been warned he would die if he had continued drinking. He persisted and eventually fell down the stairs, causing the aneurysm that killed him. These weren't the only deaths that affected Kurt. When Kurt was in 8th grade, a Montesino boy hanged himself outside one of the elementary schools. Kurt knew the boy. It was Bill Burghart's brother. Kurt, Burghart, and Rod Marsh discovered the corpse hanging from a tree as they were walking to school, and they stared at it for half an hour before school officials finally shooed them away. "It was the most grotesque thing I ever saw in my life," recalled Marsh. From Kurt's own family history and from this incident, suicide became a concept and a word that was no longer unmentionable. It was instead simply part of his milieu, just like alcoholism, poverty, or drugs. Kurt told Marsh he had suicide genes. Kurt's experimentation with drugs commenced in the 8th grade when he started smoking marijuana and using LSD. He began smoking pot at parties, then with his family, and finally smoking daily by himself. By 9th grade, he was a full-on pothead. Marijuana was cheap and plentiful in Monte, most of it homegrown, and it helped Kurt forget his home life. What began as a social ritual became his chosen anesthetic. At the time he began using drugs, he also started cutting class regularly. When he skipped school with his friends, they would buy weed or steal booze from someone's parents' liquor cabinet. But Kurt started skipping school by himself, or going to school but leaving after the first period. He saw less of his friends and appeared alienated from everything except his own anger. Trevor Briggs ran into Kurt on New Year's Eve 1980, sitting in a park in Monte by himself, swinging on a swing and whistling. Trevor invited Kurt to his parents' house, and the two got high while watching Dick Clark on television. The year ended with both of them throwing up from smoking an excessive amount of homegrown. When just a couple of years earlier it seemed like an idyllic place to go to school, soon became Kurt's own kind of prison. In conversations with his friends, he now slammed Monte, along with his parents. Having just read Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird, he declared the book a perfect description of the town. By the beginning of 1981, a different Kurt had begun to emerge, or not emerge, as was more often the case. He spent increasing amounts of time in isolation. In the Fleet Street house, he had moved to a remodeled basement bedroom. Kurt told his friends that he felt the shift was a banishment. In his basement room, Kurt spent his time with the Montgomery Ward's pinball machine he had gotten for Christmas, a stereo Don and Jenny had handed down to him, and a stack of albums. The record collection included Elton John, Grand Funk Railroad, and Boston. Kurt's favorite album that year was Journey's Evolution. His conflicts with Don and Jenny had reached a breaking point. All their attempts to get him involved with the family failed. He had begun to boycott family night, and feeling internally abandoned himself, decided to outwardly abandon his family. We had chores for him, just typical stuff, but he wouldn't do them, Don remembered. We began trying to bribe him with an allowance, but if he didn't do certain chores, we'd subtract from his allowance. But he refused to do anything. It ended up with him owing us money. He'd get violent, slam doors, and storm downstairs. He also seemed to have fewer friends. I noticed that some of his friends were dropping off, says Jenny. He was home a lot more, but he wasn't with us even when he was home. He seemed to become a lot more introverted. He was quiet and sullen. Rod Marsh recalled that Kurt killed a neighbor's cat that year. In the incident of teenage sadism, that would be in striking contrast to his adult life. He trapped the still-alive animal in his parents' chimney and laughed when it died and stunk up the house. In September 1981, Kurt began his freshman year of high school in Montesino. That fall, in an attempt to fit in, he turned out for the football team. He made the first cut, despite his small stature, an indication more than anything else of how tiny a school Montesino is. He practiced for 2 weeks, but then dropped out, complaining that it was too much work. That year he also joined the track team. He threw the discus, an amazing feat considering his frame, and ran the 200-yard dash. He was by no means the best athlete on the squad. He missed many practices, but he was one of the faster boys. He was pictured in the yearbook photo of the squad, squinting into the sun. In February of that year, in a moment of serendipity, Uncle Chuck told Kurt he could either have a bicycle or an electric guitar for his 14th birthday. To a boy who drew pictures of rock stars in his notebook, it was no choice at all. Kurt had already destroyed a Hawaiian lap guitar of Don's. He had taken it apart to study the internal workings. The guitar Chuck bought him wasn't much better. It was a cheap, second-hand Japanese model. It often broke, but to Kurt, it was the air that he breathed. Not knowing how to put the strings on it, he called up Aunt Mary and asked her if it was strung alphabetically. Once he got it working, he played it constantly and carried it to school to show it off. Everyone asked him about it, remembered Trevor Briggs. I saw him with it on the street, and he told me, "Don't ask me to play songs on this. It's broken." That didn't matter. It wasn't as much an instrument as it was an identity. Athletics were also part of his identity. He had continued with wrestling, moving up as a freshman to the varsity squad. The Montesino Bulldogs won the league championship that year with a record of 12 wins and 3 losses. Though Kurt wasn't a significant part of that effort, he began to skip more practices and matches, and on the varsity team his size was a huge disadvantage. The attitude on the JV team 2 years earlier was that wrestling was a fun way to roughhouse. The varsity team, in contrast, was deadly serious, and practices required him to wrestle boys who instantly pinned him. At the end of the season, Kurt sat for the team pitcher wearing knee-high striped socks. Among the behemoths of the team, he looked more like the trainer than the member of the squad. It was on the varsity wrestling mat that Kurt staged one of his greatest battles with his father. On the day of a championship match, as Kurt told it, he went out into the ring intending to send a message to Don in the bleachers. As Kurt later described it to Michael Azarad, "I waited for the whistle to blow, just staring straight into Don's face, and then I instantly clammed up. I put my arms together and let the guy pin me." Kurt claimed he did this 4 times in a row, was pinned instantly every time, and Don walked out in disgust. Don Cobain asserted the story was false. Kurt's classmates don't recall it and argue that anyone who intentionally lost would have been shunned, if not pummeled, by their teammates. But Leland Cobain remembered Don telling him the story after the match, saying, "That little just laid there. He wouldn't fight back." Kurt was a master at exaggerating a yarn so as to tell an emotional truth rather than an actual one. What most likely happened was that Kurt had a match against a better opponent and decided not to fight back, which was enough to anger his perfectionist father. But Kurt's telling of the tale and his description of the look that flashed between him and his father is evidence of just how much their relationship had deteriorated in the 6 years since the divorce. They had once spent every spare hour together, and on the day Dawn bought the mini bike, Kurt had never loved anyone more. Just down the street from Montesino High was a restaurant where they used to sit, the two of them alone, a singular entity, a family, and eat a quiet dinner together, joined in their loneliness. The little boy who wanted nothing more than to spend the rest of his life with his dad, and a father who only wanted someone to love him with a love that would not fade. 6 years later, father and son were locked in a wrestling match of wills, and like all great tragedies, neither combatant felt he could afford to lose. Kurt desperately needed a father, and Don needed to be wanted by his son, but neither could admit this. It was a tragedy of Shakespearean proportions. No matter how far Kurt moved away from that wrestling mat, in the corner of his eye he was always looking directly at his father, or to be more accurate, since his relationship with his father was virtually dead to him after this point, looking at his father's ghost. Almost a decade after his freshman wrestling defeat, Kurt would fire off a bitter lyric in a song titled "Serve the Servants," the words yet another move in his never-ending bout with his greatest opponent. I tried hard to have a father, but instead I had a dad. Well, that's the end of Chapter 3. Let me know what you thought of Chapter 3 in the comments. That does it for today's video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. I really appreciate the support. I'll see you next time. Until then, rock on.